This is a lecture on Genesis 12 through 50 with a focus on Abraham, the promise and faith and covenant reflected in his life. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce the patriarchal history and its leading figure Abraham, along with the themes of promise, faith, and covenant introduced in the Abraham cycle. A little bit about patriarchal history. We know what they look like. These are Semitic tribesmen that came around the time of the patriarchs. And so if we want to think what the patriarchs might have looked like, this gives you a pretty good idea. What is patriarchal history? Well, Genesis 1 through 11 describes primeval history, the earliest history. Genesis 12 through 50 describes patriarchal history, namely the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, along with Jacob's 12 sons. You can see the structure of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, gives us primeval history, creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, and Seth, Noah and the flood, the nations, and also the story of Babel. But then Genesis 12 through 50 gives us patriarchal history. And chapters 12 through the beginning of chapter 25 gives us the Abraham cycle. And then you have the Jacob cycle in chapters 25, second part, through chapter 36. And then the Joseph story in chapters 37 through 50. What is a patriarch? A patriarch as a word means a father that rules. Patri, father, and arch has to do with ruler. The term patriarch in the Bible refers to the founding fathers of the Israelite people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the latter of which also came to be called Israel. Now, there are contrasts between primeval history and patriarchal history. Primeval history is a universal history, whereas patriarchal history of chapters 12 through 50 is a family history. Primeval history focuses in on all mankind, whereas patriarchal history focuses in on Abram, who's also called Abraham, and his descendants. Primeval history discusses the origins of all nations, whereas patriarchal history only discusses the origin of one nation, at least only in detail does it discuss that, and that's the nation of Israel. Now, one of the questions that comes up is patriarchal history genuine history? And let me give an answer to those that are more skeptical about this. Can we prove the patriarchs were real people? Well, no. We cannot prove that they existed. But we can show that their historicity is plausible. For example, the patriarchal personal names fit the early 2nd millennium BC Bronze Age. For example, the name Jacob, which means God strives, is the same as a name found in ancient Near Eastern texts that occurs at Kish in 1800 BC and Terka in the 1700s BC. The name Abram, which means the father is exalted, father referring to some deity probably. Well, Ab element is used in many personal names at Mari in the 1700s BC. Mari was a site along the Euphrates River that has been excavated archaeologically with a number of texts having been found there. Benjamin literally means son of the south or son of the right hand. And it's used as a tribal name in the city of Mari. Zebulun, Asher, and Issachar, their meanings are debated, but they are attested in 18th to 20th century Egyptian texts. So all the names fit into the time period that the patriarchs are placed into. The patriarchs' unique names for God also supports historicity as a second point. Before the call of God, Abram and his father Terah were polytheists, as it says in Joshua 24 and verse 2, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, which is the Euphrates, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Abraham's family was a family of polytheists. Interestingly, even when Abram became a monotheist, he and the other patriarchs did not use the name Yahweh, which is a common name for God about 7,000 times later in the Old Testament. They do use the more rare term El for God, and this unique terminology suggests a genuinely early origin of this material. If you were making a fictional projection into the past by some, say, first millennium writer, you would expect them to project into the past the divine name used in their day. The fact that it does not reflect first millennium practice suggests a genuine early tradition for these names. Now, names used by the patriarchs include El Shaddai, using that El word, which is a word for God. The meaning of it is disputed. Traditionally, it's been understood as God Almighty. That's how the Septuagint understood it. But if it's derived from Akkadian, in Akkadian, it would mean God of the mountains. That would be the language that Abraham would have known when he lived in Ur of the Chaldeans. It would have been Akkadian, and so that's perhaps why that name was chosen. Another term for God is El Bethel, Genesis 31, verse 13, the God of Bethel. And then El Elyon, God Most High, Genesis 14 and 18. And then the everlasting God, El Olam, Genesis 21 and verse 33. And so all of these terms are El terms. They don't use the name Yahweh. And so it reflects the earlier time period before Yahweh became the term used for Israel's God. You also have contrast between patriarchal religion and Mosaic religion, and this too suggests patriarchal historicity. In the Mosaic law, you have the Levitical priesthood. But in contrast, the patriarchs practiced sacrifice without benefit of priests most of the time. In Mosaic law, you had a central sanctuary, the tabernacle, whereas in patriarchal times, there is no central sanctuary. Mosaic law prohibits marriage to half-sisters in Leviticus 18 and verse 8 and also verse 11, and similarly in Deuteronomy 27 and verse 22. But Abraham married his half-sister Sarah. Leviticus prohibits marriage to two sisters at the same time, Leviticus 18, verse 18. But Jacob married two sisters at the same time, Rachel and Leah. And the law in Deuteronomy 16, verse 21 prohibits planting of a sacred tree, whereas Abraham planted a sacred tree in Genesis 21 and verse 33. And again, if you were projecting into the past the practices of your ancestors, would you portray them as so frequently violating what came to be Mosaic law? But that's exactly what Genesis does, and that suggests that these are not just projections and something made up by imagination, but reflects real historical tradition. One of the most important themes of the patriarchal narratives is the promise. The promise consists of a promise of land, the land of Canaan, seed in the sense of descendants, and blessing. And all of this is described in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. There it reads, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.'" Now, this is the promise. And my teacher, Walter Kaiser, argued that this promise to Abram, later renamed Abraham, is the most important theme in the Old Testament. And it consists of three elements: land and seed and blessing. "Go to the land I will show you," Genesis 12 and verse 1. Genesis 12 through 50 is an account of how one man, Abram, again, eventually renamed Abraham, left Ur from what is today southern Iraq, ancient Sumer and Akkad, biblical Shinar, to go to the land of Canaan, which is in the modern state of Israel in Palestine. So Abraham left Ur the Chaldeans, which is in southern Babylonia, and went to the Egyptian administrative district named Canaan, which we now call Palestine or Israel. There you can see the travel from Ur the Chaldeans into the land of Israel, and then also when he had to go to Egypt later on. That's the land promise. Now I move on to the seed promise. I will make you into a great nation, Genesis 12 and verse 2. God promised to give Abram many descendants, despite the fact that his wife Sarai, later renamed Sarah, was barren, Genesis 11 verses 29 through 30. God promised to make Abram's seed, which can also be translated offspring, as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore, and as numerous as the stars of the sky, Genesis 13, verses 15 through 17, and 15 and verse 5. And then you have the promise of blessing. The world will be blessed through Abraham. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12, 2 and 3. You have blessing on Abram himself and his descendants, his seed. You have blessing on those who bless Abraham, or Abram. And there's blessings on all peoples on earth through Abram. Now, what's the significance of this Abrahamic promise of land, great nation, seed, descendants, and blessing? Well, the promise binds together the Old Testament and the New Testament. Galatians 3 and verse 8 refers to this promise. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. Paul calls the patriarchal promise the gospel in advance. Paul goes on to say that this promise is fulfilled in Abraham's seed, namely Jesus. That it is through Jesus that all nations can ultimately find blessing. Now, this shows us that Old Testament religion was not meant to be a narrow ethnic religion. It was always meant to be for the whole world, right from the beginning. A second thing that the promise shows, the promise binds primeval history with patriarchal history. We saw how Genesis 1 through 11 deals with the problem of the fall and the spread of sin among all peoples. Now, Genesis 12, 1 through 3 gives God's answer to that problem. That answer to the problem is going to be through Abraham's seed and ultimately his greatest seed and descendant, Jesus Christ. In other words, God chose one of the various families of the earth in the table of nations of Genesis 10, the family of Abraham, to be a blessing to all. This promise, thirdly, also has the significance of being a central theme of the Pentateuch and arguably the whole Old Testament. So you have the promise of seed. Well, you have that in the story of Genesis of the barren patriarchal wives and a famine threatening the seed of promise. But then in Exodus chapter 1, the descendants of Abraham multiply in Egypt and become large in numbers. In the book of Numbers, you actually count how many descendants of Abraham has come. And then even though disaster and destruction comes upon the nation at various times, there is a remnant, and the prophets promise that God would preserve a remnant despite anything else that might happen to Israel. And Christ in believers according to Galatians chapter 3, are the ultimate seed of Abraham, at least by adoption. So you have the seed promise, but then you also have the land promise, where Abram and Jacob are forced to leave the land and go to Egypt in the case of Abram, and go to Haran in the case of Jacob. Both of those were a threat to the land promise. Then in Exodus, Israel sojourned in Egypt. That was a threat to the land promise. But then in Joshua, they come and they conquer the land, and that fulfills, in part, the land promise. But then they are forced to flee the land and go into Babylonian exile. That's a threat to the land promise. But then they come back from exile, and that fulfills the land promise. And the New Testament sees that land promise as foreshadowing and ultimately fulfilled in heaven, the ultimate land of promise. And then the blessing promise is also seen throughout the Bible, the blessing on Abraham and his seed. But then you see God's care for Israel in Egypt, how he brings them into a land of blessing, a land flowing with milk and honey. And that ultimately all nations are blessed through Christ. So land and seed and blessing, it ties together not only Genesis and the patriarchal story, but also the whole Pentateuch, arguably the whole Old Testament, and indeed is a major theme in the entire Bible. The doctrine of election is illustrated by Abraham. God chose Abraham to be the line of election. And his seed, namely Israel, became the line of election. Abraham was chosen by God for a special purpose. Though understand that election doesn't always work the way some people think it does. Abraham is not chosen to be blessed and the others damned, but rather Abraham is chosen so that all the other nations could be blessed. The second theme in the patriarchal narratives is the theme of faith. And you get that, among other places, in Genesis 15 and verse 6. There it says, starting in verse 4, then the word of the Lord came to him, to Abram, this man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. And he took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And here's the point. Abram believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, credited it to him as righteousness. Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 5 says that this verse in Genesis 15:6 shows that Abraham was justified, you might say saved, by faith, because righteousness was accredited to him before he did anything, before he was circumcised, before he worked. He was saved by faith. And Abraham is known in the Bible as the great man of faith. See Galatians 3 and verse 9. He believed God's promises to come to Canaan, and that God would give him offspring despite the barrenness of his wife. And you see something of his faith also in the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. Abraham showed faith by being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac when God commanded him to do so. And according to Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19, Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead. He had that much faith. And so he was not afraid to do what God commanded him to do. Of course, God intervened and did not allow him to sacrifice his son, but Abraham trusted in God. And so he's an example of faith for us today as well. Yet another theme in the patriarchal narratives is the theme of covenant, which we see in Genesis 15 and also verse 17. And there are a number of important covenants in the Bible. The covenant with Noah in Genesis chapter 9, where God promised never to destroy the world with a flood again. The covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15 and also verse 17, which we'll look at in a moment. You have the Mosaic covenant established in Exodus 19 through 24. Then you have the Davidic covenant, which is established in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And finally, you have the new covenant predicted by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, and fulfilled in Jesus Christ, as Hebrews chapter 8 says. Covenants with Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David each build on each other. In other words, Abrahamic covenant does not negate the covenant made with Noah, but builds on it. The same with the Mosaic covenant. It builds on the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant commanded circumcision. Mosaic covenant, they continue to have circumcision. Same thing with the Davidic covenant. However, there is more discontinuity between the New Covenant and all these Old Testament covenants combined. Now, when you think of the word covenant, think of the word relationship. When God establishes a covenant with a group of people, he's establishing a certain kind of relationship, a special kind of relationship. A covenant establishes and regulates relationships. In Genesis 15, it speaks of the covenant being established. Abraham sacrificed a heifer, a goat, a ram, and 2 birds and placed their pieces all in a row. And then God appeared as a fire pot that passed between the pieces of the animals. Verse 13 of chapter 15. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. That's the Egyptian sojourn. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. That's the Exodus. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Can't have the land yet. The Amorites haven't sinned enough yet. Verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces, that is, the pieces of the animals. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. The river of Egypt, by the way, is a wadi between Canaan and Egypt, not the Nile. The land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and Jebusites. This passage predicts Israel's sojourn in Egypt and predicts the conquest of Canaan. Your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, it says, but they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But then God would give them the land of the Canaanites and those other tribes. 400 is a round number for what is more specifically 430 years that they were in Egypt, according to Exodus 12 and verse 40. God appeared in this vision as a fire pot, a smoking fire pot. God is often symbolized by fire in the Bible. And God engaged in an oath ceremony to show the earnestness of his commitment. He promised, to your descendants I will give this land, and dramatized the oath through a ritual in which God passed between the pieces of the animals. And you have a similar ritual found in Jeremiah 34, verses 18 through 20, and similar procedures found in the ancient Near East. You have in the 1700s that the city of Mari on the Euphrates, to make a covenant is idiomatically described as to kill a donkey. And what you would do if you were a human doing this, you would go between the animal and take an oath. May God, or if you're a polytheist, the gods, do to me what has been done to this animal if I fail to keep my promise. You're putting a self-curse on yourself. By going through this ceremony, God showed Abraham his earnestness to fulfill the land promise. And it says that God established a covenant through that ceremony. The Lord made a covenant with Abram. And this covenant appears to be unconditional. Abraham doesn't have to do anything to merit this relationship. It all depended on God's grace in offering it to Abram. Genesis 17 adds a twist to this covenant. He gives Abraham, or Abram at the time, a new name and establishes circumcision as a practice. First of all, the new name: no longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. Abram and Abraham both mean the father is exalted. And then Sarai is also given a new name, Sarah, which means princess. And these new names symbolize their new special relationship with God. Chapter 17 and verse 10, circumcision is commanded. Circumcision of the male foreskin relates to the seed promise, involving as it does the instrument of procreation. The cutting of the male genital served as a reminder in the flesh of Israelite men of their need to walk before me and be blameless. Genesis 17 and verse 1. Whenever they saw the scar there, that was a reminder of what they were to do symbolically because of that. In other words, the sexual organ was being dedicated to God. Well, that's a brief introduction to Abraham and the promise, faith, and covenant made with him. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.